A malevolent darkness slithered through the shadows of Soviet cities in the late 1970s, bringing with it a specter of boundless evil that would terrorize the nation for over a decade. When the first mutilated bodies of children began appearing discarded near train stations and bus stops like trash, it immediately became clear a vicious predator was ruthlessly stalking the most vulnerable members of society. This merciless killer was Andrei Chikatilo, a former school teacher whose slayings of women and children would define him. As the notorious Red Ripper of Rostov and one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history, Chikatilo's crimes were defined by nearly incomprehensible brutality. Beginning in 1978, this lanky, mild-mannered man transformed behind closed doors into a monster of the most sinister variety, convincing them to follow him into nearby forests where he would then unleash unspeakable violence upon them. There, away from any potential savior, this human demon would bind his young victims' wrists so tightly that circulation was cut off, leaving deep bruises as they struggled helplessly. With manic intensity blazing in his eyes, Chikatilo would descend upon the terrified children like a rabid animal, stabbing and slashing relentlessly with his knife as blood sprayed wildly around the darkened forest. Gripped by twisted sexual depravity, he would hack and tear into the small torsos of his prey as they screamed and begged for their lives. Driven by demented compulsions beyond understanding, he gouged out eyes and hacked off body parts, sometimes even slicing out organs which he would later eat or keep as souvenirs. When his frenzied mutilation finally ended, the forest floor would be stained dark crimson with the blood of his butchered victims, their bodies barely recognizable as human anymore. Chikatilo later chillingly claimed he believed that by stabbing children and teenagers to death, he could absorb their youth and energy for himself, somehow growing stronger through his barbarism. There was no limit to the depravity Chikatilo would inflict upon the vulnerable youths who crossed his path. 10-year-old Olga Stalmachanuk, whom he had lured away from a cinema with promises of toys, was later discovered totally disemboweled, her young belly savagely ripped open with entrails and organs strewn around her corpse. When 13-year-old Lubov Biryuk disappeared from her home village after going out to buy milk, she was found days later brutally stabbed 22 times, with her eyes viciously removed and genitals cut off in a savage display of mutilation. The ritualistic nature of each killing was apparent, as if the maniac was compelled to acts of increasing sadism each time, trying to outdo his own previous horrors. A 16-year-old girl named Irina was found naked in the woods, her tongue sliced completely off and rammed grotesquely into her vaginal cavity by her killer. But castrated, with his testicles cut off and shoved into his mouth in a nightmarish scene of torture. The striking similarities between each gory murder scene pointed clearly to a single phantom perpetrator, leaving no clues beyond the gruesome carnage he left behind. Like a monster from a terrifying myth, he would emerge only periodically, to claim new prey before disappearing once again, multiplying his body count as police stumbled in his wake. As mutilated bodies continued to pile up around Soviet cities at a staggering rate, paranoia and dread metastasized through local communities like a dark cancer of fear. Parents began keeping children indoors at all times and walked them to school in groups, terrified they could be the Ripper's next victim if caught alone. At bus and train stations, the few brave souls who ventured out peered anxiously over their shoulders between destinations, avoiding dimly lit areas or tunnels where the predator was known to grab passing youths unnoticed. Police warnings echoed in parents' heads as they kissed their little ones goodbye each morning, the possibility of never seeing their child again threatening to break some. At night, an even more potent and chilling terror took hold. In the pitch blackness, imagination spiraled out of control. Almost worse was the specter of injustice, that this depraved animal was still roaming free, able to snatch and mutilate anyone's baby or child in daylight before escaping unpunished. Citizens reported feeling unsafe to even walk city streets in broad daylight anymore. Paralyzed by the knowledge, the fiend could be calmly passing them at that very moment in mundane anonymity between his slaughtering sprees. Death permeated the night air in those bleak times, its stench seeming to linger everywhere like the stale odor of drying blood. The shadow of dread the Red Ripper cast was bone deep, choking the life and spirit from communities like an icy cloak of fear. Authorities repeatedly failed over many years to apprehend the elusive child murderer who evaded capture like smoke after every kill. As flawed police work saw innocent men scapegoated and even executed for the Ripper's sins, while the real monster carried on roaming freely. For over a decade without pause, the sprawling Soviet system proved incapable of stopping the nightmarish cycle of violence. As mangled bodies continued to appear across cities with horrific regularity, and children kept vanishing seemingly into thin air, never to return. Each gruesome discovery was a crushing body blow to communist propaganda about their progressive socialist utopia. Such consistent failure to catch one man soaked their image in humiliation before the global stage, revealing the rot of corruption and impotence festering at the dark heart of their police state. Public shame turned to outright outrage with the gut-wrenching revelation that Chikatilo had been arrested and released uncharged multiple times over the years, even briefly considered a suspect before being allowed to walk free. Stubbornly clinging to draconian old tactics, police refused to employ new psychological profiling techniques gaining credence in the West that may have identified the killer, preferring forced and falsified confessions instead that let the butcher carry on unimpeded. Only after 12 nightmarish years and at least 53 confirmed victims was Chikatilo finally identified and apprehended. Rather than brilliant police work, it was pure chance that ended the manhunt. As he was spotted by an officer at a bus station exhibiting strange and suspicious behavior before being reeled in. The magnitude of his crimes reduced even hardened officers to tears and left the public reeling, but also simmering with outrage at those whose incompetence allowed the body count to climb so high for so long. Before Chikatilo's highly publicized 1992 trial, a psychiatrist named Dr. but shamefully seeking to avoid executing such an embarrassing monster that their system failed to catch for over a decade. Prosecutors pushed the court to instead have Chikatilo declared mentally unfit, arguing that no sane man could commit such depravity. The judge rejected this blatant attempt to sweep the Ripper's crimes under the rug of insanity. After a full confession to an utterly shocked courtroom, Chikatilo was convicted on 52 counts of murder and sentenced to death by firing squad. On February 14, 1994, he was executed with a single gunshot to the head. The bullet that ended his life could not undo the decades of damage left in his wake. But it did provide a small measure of justice and closure for victims' families, along with relief that the butcher could never kill again. When this phantom menace was finally dragged bloodied from the shadows into the bright lights of the courtroom, the number of victims alone was numbing to comprehend, let alone the obscene savagery inflicted on each one. The depths of his psychotic cruelty shook the public conscience of Soviet society to its very core. This real-life monster had ripped and torn his way through countless lives right under their noses while they stubbornly denied that capitalism had no monopoly on madness. Chikatilo's 12 years of slaughter brutally exposed the festering rot at communism's core that authorities tried desperately to hide from their people and the world. But it was on the deeply human level that Chikatilo's atrocities cut the deepest. So many families faced a grief beyond words, robbed of their beloved kin in the most horrific way. Parents were now deprived of seeing their little ones blossom into adulthood, their pride and joy gutted by this fiend's knife, just as they were taking their first steps in life. For them, the emotional scars would persist long after the physical bloodstains faded. The hollow emptiness left inside mothers and fathers who outlived their children felt like an eternal, ragged hole that could never be filled. And for many of the older victims on the cusp of adulthood, the light of promise was forever extinguished. An entire generation was left deeply traumatized, their psyche forever scarred by the terror they grew up under the shadow of as children. For them, the ubiquitous dread of knowing they or their own kids could become random victims haunted many well into adulthood. Even decades later, something as simple as the image of Chikatilo's crazed eyes, flashing unexpectedly on a television screen, could trigger panic attacks and bone-chilling flashbacks. Most disturbingly, as with any notorious killer, Chikatilo's brutal legacy continued through the damaged minds and distorted obsessions of followers like the serial killer Alexander Pichushkin, who murdered dozens across Russia to mimic his idol's infamy. The prospect that more psychos would follow this blueprint and attempt to replicate such wanton violence was truly frightening to consider. Though brought to justice at last, the poisonous memory of fear and helplessness, imprinted on a generation from Chikatilo's decade of terror, lingered on like an open societal wound, the psychological effects too deep to easily heal. Just the name Andrei Chikatilo invoked a visceral unease, the horrors linked to it permanently seared into the nation's consciousness. A darkness had been revealed that could not recede fully back into the shadows, only fade. In the end, the tragic significance of the Red Ripper's grisly crimes was how they unexpectedly exposed unsettling truths that had long festered unseen beneath the surface of Soviet society. Chikatilo's decade-long rampage ruthlessly ripped apart the utopian facade of a perfect communist system that leaders desperately promoted to their people and the world. But the killer had also held up a mirror that forced the usher to confront the realities it sought desperately to hide or ignore within itself: the poverty, mental illness, child abuse, and other societal maladies that create monsters like Chikatilo in the first place. His reign of terror proved that unchecked evil could take root and thrive even in the supposed workers' paradise. And it laid bare how an oppressive system that valued propaganda above all else allowed his evil to flourish right under their noses, and would again in the future if not addressed at its roots. On an even deeper level, Chikatilo's attacks cut to the vulnerable heart of a society's collective innocence. The unspeakable depravity of his violations against children forced an entire nation to recognize and grapple with the idea that humanity was capable of exhibiting bottomless cruelty, even among its own. His was a soulless evil that scarred Soviet culture by showing how suddenly an otherwise ordinary man could transform into a gruesome nightmare made flesh. The possibility of such darkness dwelling latent within anyone ruptured a communal faith in innate goodness, and it shattered the philosophical security found in believing monsters are different from normal people, instead revealing they simply lack the restraints of morality and conscience that hold human impulses in check. For many, to even speak this killer's name was to invoke the presence of evil, to recall a time when the devil himself walked freely among them. Above all, the seeming randomness and senselessness of his acts shocked the public conscience, showing how detached from reason evil can become. Most serial killers pursue recognizable goals, following their own twisted moral codes. But Chikatilo's victims were not means to an end. The women and children he butchered were merely the helpless vessels onto which he explosively projected his psychotic rage and desires. Without purpose or meaning behind their slaughter beyond his own wild bloodlust. The families left grieving were not people to him, but faceless collateral damage along his savage path. He did not know them or care to. It was this utter lack of even an attempt at rationale or restraint to his horrors that marked Chikatilo as the embodiment of wickedness. A man so consumed by inner demons that he lashed out at the innocent for no reason at all except to satisfy purely selfish, savage compulsions divorced from reality. The bloody chronicle of Andrei Chikatilo stands as a harrowing milestone in the landscape of 20th century crime that has rightfully earned him infamy as one of the most prolific and twisted serial killers the modern world has confronted, by exclusively targeting the most vulnerable members of society. His despicable crimes sank the Soviet Union to uncharted depths of depravity in their quest for justice, forcing the communist system to finally confront its deepest flaws that allowed such evil to thrive. But it was Chikatilo's ruthless exposure of humanity's frailty and false securities. The slightest mention of his name invokes chilling visions of the terrors within men's hearts once exposed to the light. For many Soviets, those years under the cloud of his crimes became a defining era. A time when the devil himself walked freely and brazenly amongst them and challenged everything they thought they knew about good and evil. Even long after his execution, the Ripper's ghosts lingered on. Chikatilo's bloody rampage through their cities forced an entire generation to mature quickly, shedding the innocence of youth far too soon as the stability of daily life was shattered by sweeping tides of terror far beyond their control. The damage inflicted in their formative years was collective trauma that forever changed Soviet society during those dark times. The families of those ripped away struggled to comprehend the meaning behind such meaningless bloodshed, and to reinvent futures torn asunder without warning. And for the Soviet system itself, its failure to contain a single savage murderer for over 12 years brutally exposed the need for deep societal self-reflection that Communist Party propaganda had long suppressed and smothered. In the end, more than any particular murders he committed, Andrei Chikatilo's greater crime was raising the walls that divide human darkness from innocence, and forcing an entire nation to recognize how suddenly they can come crashing down if not guarded closely. The mutilating danger he posed came not just from his knife, but the uncomfortable truths his crimes reflected about society back upon itself, and from within our beliefs of security if left blind to festering shadows.